Hello, and welcome to The View from Israel. I'm Barry Shaw. Now, earlier this year, I interviewed Kenneth Lewis. Mr. Lewis is a Swedish lawyer who is currently representing 7 plaintiffs in a little-known but very important trial taking place in Stockholm. It concerns an Iranian who was arrested as he arrived in Sweden, who is now facing charges of crimes against humanity. Now, this trial carries with it huge global implications, but the world media seems reluctant or uninformed to write about it or report about it. On the other hand, we at the Israel Institute of Strategic Studies will inform you of this case via The View from Israel, and part of that process is introducing you to key people involved in this affair. I think you're going to be intrigued, if not shocked. And towards the end of the show, I'm going to ask you or tell you how to get involved if this interview moves you as it does me. So welcome to the show, Kaveh Moussavi.
Good afternoon to you, Mary. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Thank you for accepting my invitation. Now, tell our viewers something about your background. You're a human rights lawyer and you researched and I think talked at Oxford University. Tell our viewers something about your background in international law as it pertains to human rights.
My background is I'm originally from Iran. I left Iran in 1964. My father was a senator in the former regime, the imperial government. I was finishing my doctorate here at Oxford University when the Iranian Revolution came. And of course, the plans for returning and serving the country were somewhat scuppered, you could say. And then I had previously also read law, but I decided to continue I did a DPhil here in politics at Oxford University, but clearly there wasn't much prospect of continuing with that. And the behavior of the Iranian regime has been more and more egregious since its inception. You will recall 48 hours after coming to power, they murdered 4 of the Shah's generals, and then that regime of mass murder has continued. One of the most egregious crimes was the 1988 Prison Massacre, which unfortunately is not very well known. It was the subject of a deep study by Geoffrey Robertson, Queen's Counsel, who was the president of the International Criminal Tribunal for Sierra Leone. And he wrote that report, and I had the honor to assist him in doing that. We had a conference in Oxford University in 2011, in November 2011, where the issue of impunity for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and other crimes such as torture was exhaustively discussed, and the remedies that were available were discussed. At that conference, several of the victims of the 1988 massacre were present. And there they asked me whether I thought, in my considered opinion, it would be possible to bring to trial any of the instigators of that egregious crime. And my definitive view was, yes, it can be possible. And all we need is evidence. And evidence means if any of these people were in the jurisdiction, we would be capable of arresting them and bringing them to trial. Well, lo and behold, 8 years after that conference, I received a call on the morning of the 17th of October from one of the victims who said that he had hard information from the son-in-law of one of these people, one named Hamid Nouri, who's arriving in Sweden very, very shortly. How much time would I need to arrest him? I said, much more important than time is the question of evidence. What kind of evidence do you have? And he said, well, what kind of evidence do you need? I said, bring me 3 witnesses and I'll arrest him. And indeed, he came over to London, and I interviewed with one of my colleagues. I made sure it's a non-Iranian colleague. We took a statement and then opened discussions with the War Crimes Unit of the Swedish Prosecution Service. And of course, between that time and his arrival, we had 20 days in which to prepare the complaint. And we did. And on the afternoon of 9th of November 2019, when Mr. Hamid Nouri, passing by the other name of Hamid Abbasi, arrived at the airport, he was arrested, and His trial began on the 10th of August under the rule of universal jurisdiction. In the case of cases that are crimes that are so egregious that they are said to violate the conscience of humankind. And that is why Sweden was able to establish jurisdiction over this. I made it a professional career of mine to pursue these people. It's the first case in Iran that I've been able to manage to succeed in, but we are now preparing other indictments against others, and we hope that this is the beginning of something that is going to have the kind of impact that we are hoping against the Iranian regime. That, in a nutshell, is how I became involved. And the victim contacted me because he knew that professionally I was engaged in these activities. And, well, I think, as he says, and he said quite frequently, he clearly didn't make a mistake to have faith in the law and its ability to ensure at least at this stage, the beginning of a trial. I have no doubt what the outcome will be, but perhaps we can discuss that in due course.
Oh, okay. Let's personalize it a bit more. What can you tell me about Hamid Nouri? Who is he? What position did he hold? What are the crimes that he's been accused of that committed? What's the size of the crimes? Was it minor, was it major, or whatever? And why he was arrested? In other words, personalize this person, Hamid Nouri, position him in the positions that basically affected his arrest.
Mr. Nuri was a young man at the time. We are talking 33 years ago. He's now 61. He was one of the fanatics who joined the revolution. He's very proud of having engaged in the massacres that took place in the Iranian province of Kurdistan immediately after the revolution. He thinks he was serving the revolution. And he's obviously not aware that serving the revolution, fine, but there are things called international crimes, crimes against humanity. And I am seriously considering, based on his own testimony at the trial, that he was there to bring new charges against him in due course for the massacres and the mass murder that took place in Iranian Kurdistan back in late 1979, 1980. Be that as it may, with respect to this particular arrest and trial, he was a deputy prosecutor at a notorious prison in Iran called the Gohardasht prison. He was also at Evin prison, which is slightly better known. And his task was to select the victims who would appear before this committee, which was known as the Death Committee, made up of one of the members of it was the man Raisi, who's the mass murderer, who's now the president of Iran, and very much claims credit for what he's done in those horrific days of July, August of 1988. He was identified by many of the prisoners who survived the massacre. It is estimated that up to 5,000 people were murdered in the period of approximately 6 to 8 weeks, as a result of the fatwa, the death order command by the late unlamented Ayatollah Khomeini, who, when he drank the bitter cup of defeat in the Iran-Iraq war, he had to find victims in order to distract attention for the catastrophe that they had brought upon Iran, the Islamic Ayatollahs. And what better way of distracting attention from the price that the Iranian people had paid for the catastrophic mistake of following this man and these people, than to bring about these trials. And so it was the case that they took advantage of the fact that the MKO, Mujahideen, had attacked Iran in the immediate aftermath of the UN Security Council resolution regarding a ceasefire and ending the war, which of course was of 8 years standing, but Ayatollah Khomeini only accepted it when it became clear that Iran was defeated, is going to be even more badly defeated in the war. He accepted that, and so the Mujahideen seized the chance opportunistically, and they attacked Iran. Of course, they were massacred. It was a complete catastrophe, but nonetheless, the opportunity was seized by Khomeini to pour blame and bring about that massive destruction. And so 5,000 people who were already in prison had nothing to do with the attack on Iran. How could they? They were all in prison. Some of them had been there for 6, 7 years. Some of them were arrested when they were 11, 12 years old. They'd been distributing MKO newspapers or leftist newspapers belonging to the various Marxist organizations. And they were brought to trial. They brought to trial, well, it's a misnomer to use it, they call it a trial. 4 questions: are you a Muslim? Do you pray? Are you willing to walk on a minefield? Are you willing to repent on television? If the slightest hint of reluctance was exhibited, the code word that Hamid Nouri was given was take them back to their cells. Of course, these were prisoners who were blindfolded and they didn't know where they were going. And the code was take them back to cells was meant take them back to their, can you imagine, to the prayer hall, the place of where there's serene sobriety and where people sit and think and pray and meditate and try to reach their maker, and they were summarily hanged, some 5,000 of them. Hamid Nouri was one of the principal instigators and actors in this event, and he's been identified by literally hundreds of people. He went under the name of Hamid Abbasi. Clearly, they knew what they were doing was a criminal act. That's why they hid their identities. Even though they enjoyed massive impunity at the time, the world was a different place in 1988 to what it is today. But nonetheless, there was. He carried out these mass murders and enjoyed impunity for until the 9th of November 2019. He had been to Sweden and to Germany and to various other European countries on a number of occasions before, and clearly he thought that he enjoyed impunity, and clearly he did, just like many others of this regime. But the law has an uncanny habit of catching up with people, and these mass murderers usually think they can hide, and after a while they'll be forgotten. But the only problem for them is that international human rights law and international criminal law has moved on. These crimes are not subject to statute of limitations, and there is universal jurisdiction over these crimes, and any court anywhere has jurisdiction to arrest these people and bring them to trial, which is exactly what happened in this case.
So first of all, I want to say chapeau, hats up to the Iranian human rights activists who were putting the files together, and maybe yourself as well, who was preparing the legal appeal to the authorities in Sweden to have this man arrested prior to his arrival in Sweden. So can you tell us something about, for me, the intriguing background of the people who are involved about actually keeping track on this gentleman and keeping a file on him and actually preparing the legal background that enabled the Swedish authorities to willingly have this man arrested when he arrived at the airport?
Well, I'm glad, Barry, I'm glad you asked that question, because it really is a black mark of shame in the history of the Iranian opposition that they have never paid attention to the law. The empire of the law is an autonomous empire. It has an uncanny habit of surprising people. And in this instance, I have been screaming for the better part of 20 years that the Iranian opposition ought to take the law and international criminal law seriously, at least since the conference in Rome in 1998, when most of the trends which began with the Nuremberg Tribunal and the International Criminal Tribunal in Tokyo, and they got together at the end of the Cold War at the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the Special UN Tribunal for Sierra Leone, East Timor, and others, Cambodia. The law has been moving forward, but unfortunately, the Iranian opposition has not paid any attention to this. There were a few of us who were beginning to take this to the next stage. There was in 2012 a symbolic tribunal like the Russell Tribunal, which was in London, Iran Tribunal by a friend and colleague of mine, Hamid Nouri, who set up it was a symbolic trial regarding precisely this massacre, the 1988 Prison Massacre, in which testimony was taken from many of the victims who came and testified before a body of international legal scholars, Jeffrey Knights and others who were there, who were able to assess the evidence and provide a record of what had happened. And in fact, I am extremely grateful for their efforts because we relied on that to be able to persuade the Swedish authorities that this is not just hearsay. There are three witnesses that we interviewed and took evidence from in London and backed up with the evidence of the Iran Tribunal, was such that we were able to convince the prosecutor in Sweden to take this matter seriously. Prosecutors obviously would have every reason to be somewhat skeptical, talking about events that took place 31 years ago at the time, when he was arrested in a different country, under a different culture, under different norms and different laws, the difficulties of obtaining the evidence and all the rest of it, the myriad kind of problems that a prosecutor would face. But nonetheless, because of the efforts of some of the Iranian more legally oriented members of the opposition, we were able to gather that evidence. In addition to that, the Burumand Foundation had commissioned the report by Jeffrey Robertson, Queen's Counsel, who happened to also be the head of the Sierra Leone Tribunal. He had the credentials to be able to assess the kind of evidence that he was being provided, and he was able to dismiss some of it and accept the rest of it. And so backed with these documents, as well as the testimony of the three witnesses that we had, we were able to convince the prosecution service of this.
Yes, I think it's to Europe's embarrassment that people coming from criminal regimes guilty of mass murder, as well as members of internationally designated terror organizations, are arrogantly coming in and out of Europe, as I said before, with impunity. Something's going to be done about that. But let me come on to the trial of Hamid Nouri. Can you tell us, first of all, how the trial is proceeding? When do you anticipate it will reach its conclusion? And based on the evidence presented so far and your legal expertise, what do you predict the verdict will be?
The trial will go on until April. It's a massive effort because there are a great many witnesses. We're talking of events of 33 years ago, and a lot of the witnesses are victims of torture. They are survivors, not in the sense of the survivors of Auschwitz and the death camps, but in a sense, survivors of torture, and they have witnessed mass murder. And so psychologically, they suffer from some of the traumas that a lot of the survivors of the Holocaust obviously are not on the same scale, but quantitatively not on the same scale, but qualitatively in terms of the mental torment and torture that many of these people suffered. Some were in prison for a decade, and they'd witnessed the murder of thousands of their friends, and so they are mostly under psychiatric care. Some of them suffer from diabetes. You can see that a great many of them that I have interviewed and I've seen, you can see they're suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm no psychiatrist, but I've certainly talked to psychiatrists, and they can see that this is the inevitable consequence of that. So, but I'm not worried. 33 years after the event, so some of the memories are a little bit cloudy. a little bit blurred, but nonetheless, the simple weight of the evidence, it is such a powerful case that there is no way that the outcome will be anything other than conviction of Hamid Nouri. Conviction, he will get a life sentence. His only hope was, I think he's lost it now, but was if he showed not necessarily remorse, because international criminal law, it would help if there was remorse, but of course, when it comes to sentencing, it would help. But more important than that is the cooperating with the prosecutor and at least telling the victims where their loved ones are buried. It would help very much. I have lost count, although I keep meticulous records. I've lost count of the numbers of parents, mothers, who rang me and pleaded, and they said, please ask Nuri to tell us where our child is buried. That's all we want. We don't want revenge. We don't even insist on his punishment. We just want to know where our children are buried, because they were all buried in mass graves with no markers, nothing. The bodies were never returned. Sometimes, more often not, just a bag saying this is the belongings of your child, and often the belongings were the wrong person's, So you find someone else's clothes as having been packed and given to you and saying this is what's left of your son or your daughter. Hamid Nouri has shown no indication, not only of remorse, but any willingness to cooperate, although I have tried to get the message to him that, look, yours is a forlorn, it's a hopeless case. You cannot hope to deny. He has tried to deny the actual events of 1988 massacre. There are those people who you just can't persuade that evidence and documents and facts will not shift their position. The current president of Iran is a man who denies the Holocaust. Khamenei is a man who denies the Holocaust, despite the millions of documents produced at the Nuremberg Tribunal, at the Eichmann Tribunal in Israel. Despite the voluminous historical research that's been done, and even the Bader Olson documents that have not even been opened yet, the International Red Cross documents on the committee of the identification of the disappeared and all that. Even the evidence is so overwhelming, and yet there are people who deny it. So this man is in denial. He clearly thinks now that his former boss has become the president of Iran, that he will somehow be sprung from the grip of justice. Little does he know that the current president of Iran doesn't dare step outside Iran himself, because there's a serious risk, and I hope you'll ask me a question or two about that he himself might face a similar fate to Nuri. Well, if not now, I have no doubt, I repeat, no doubt, and I say this through your television camera, Mr. Raisi, you will be arrested one day. Just like the Nazis, who 75 years after the Holocaust are still being picked up and being withdrawn, you and your boss Khamenei will be arrested unless you die like in the fate of Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein. So Nuri thinks that he's going to be sprung, and he's very shall we say, arrogant posture in the trial has not helped him at all. So you question, what do you think? What do I think is the outcome of the trial? He'll be convicted. What do I think he'll get? I think he'll get a life sentence. It's far too late for him to try and bring about any evidence by way of mitigation. He could have done that. He didn't. And in international criminal law, there is no such thing as plea bargaining. You can say, you can try to reduce the sentence by showing remorse, but much more important, actually beginning to cooperate and saying where the victims are, for example. Who else? We still don't know, 33 years after the event, we still don't know the full chain of command. There are those who we know were participants in this mass murder, but we don't know their identity yet. For all we know, they still come and go to Europe and elsewhere, and we still don't know who they are. Nuri could help himself and the victims and the cause of justice, just to begin with those three, by saying who they were. He was asked several times of the prosecutor, and he said, can you imagine the sheer gall of the man saying, I cannot interfere with the privacy of those individuals. Here's a man who, in a heartbeat, was willing to murder something like 5,000 people. And now he's concerned about the right to privacy, Article 8 rights under the European Convention on Human Rights, of some of the most egregious violators of human rights himself. But that's the nature of the man, and that's the nature of the beast that we are dealing with. I saw this not physically myself, but I read about it in the transcripts of the Nuremberg Tribunal. And so, shall we say, the beast has not changed its nature. It's still the same. But what they have missed is that the law has caught up. International criminal law has caught up, and the arena for impunity is getting more and more constrained by the hour. And I hope the example of Nuri will send a shockwaves, as it has through the Iranian system, so that the rude awakening that they have had, they could not believe that Nuri would be arrested, and even more, they couldn't believe that he wouldn't be sprung, he wouldn't be exchanged by Iran grabbing a few hostages, as it has done in the past, and successfully managed to bring about an exchange. And thirdly, they didn't believe that the trial would actually begin. I've lost count of the number of messages that I received from Iran saying, from inside the IRGC, who's saying, you have no idea how petrified our bosses are. They had no idea. They just could not believe, A, that this man would be arrested, and B, that the trial would begin, and that... And I said, wait, I've got news for you. Please convey to your bosses, the man is going to be convicted. And that conviction is going to be an appendix to the indictment of Khamenei and the indictment of Raisi and the several thousand other of the most egregious accused who are going to be brought to trial eventually in Iran or elsewhere.
In the 80s, there was something established by the Iranian regime called the Death Commission. And people that were summarily arrested for so-called crimes against the regime, tortured and murdered, including women. I understand the numbers are in the thousands, and the only crime they committed was to be in opposition to the regime. Am I correct in my assumption?
You're absolutely right. There was Ayatollah Khomeini issued a decree the day after he accepted the UN Security Council resolution on the ceasefire, which brought the war to an end. And he issued a decree in which he said, all those prisoners, please note, Barry, those prisoners who are already in prison, not people who are picked up from the streets, not people who have been part of the Mujahideen's efforts to attack Iran and cross the border from Iraq into Iran the day after the acceptance of the resolution. Not those. I say this in parenthesis because the justification that the Iranian regime started espousing and putting out after the news of this massacre started leaking out, for years they were denying it. They were completely denying that it existed, completely denying, until Human Rights Watch and various other human rights organizations started pointing to it and the evidence to it. And one of the members of the death committee was Mr. Pur Mohammadi, just like this man Raisi, who became the Minister of Justice. Would you believe it? Minister of Justice. And yet, simply, this was a mass murder for opinion. If you were, Khomeini's decree said, if they're steadfast, the word steadfast was used. If they were steadfast in their opinions, they should be killed, and there should be no mercy, and there should be no bureaucratic impediments. When the Chief Justice at the time, who was taken aback, wrote to Khomeini and said, but these people have been sentenced already to 6-7 years, and some of them, their sentences are up, and they should have been due for release. And the response of Khomeini was, stop bothering me with these legal niceties. If they're steadfast, kill them. These are documents. And in the documentation center of Khomeini's archives, these documents exist. They've not been denied. For the regime to come and say that this egregious crime was carried out at a time when Iran was invaded. Well, the actual invasion by Iraq took place in September 1980. This massacre took place in July, August 1988. So it's kind of 8 years too late to come and use that particular excuse for this murder, mass murder. And also, this was after the end of the war. There's no question that this was a crime against humanity. Innocent prisoners, innocent in the sense that the overwhelming majority of them were guilty of nothing other than distributing newspapers or being sympathizers of this or that group of opposition. Remember, it wasn't just the MKO, it was also the supporters of the Communist Party of Iran, supporters of the former guerrilla organizations, who were not members of the guerrilla organization, but people who've been selling their newspapers, kids who've been selling newspapers. There was a lawyer who, when brought and asked the question, he said, under the Constitution, you cannot engage in investigation, inquisitional practices of investigating ideas. And he was hanged. So this is the kind of catastrophe that was carried out. For years, they denied it. They denied it. Pur Mohammadi's excuse was, we were invaded. Well, the invasion was 8 years before, but, oh, you mean the attack on Iran carried out after the Security Council resolution? Well, that was attack carried out by members of the Mujahideen Khalq organization who were based in Iraq, not by individuals who were sitting inside Gohar prison, who'd been there for the better part of 7-8 years. So one cannot possibly be linked to the efforts of the regime to try to pretend that these were activists who were. The decree itself is unambiguous. It's unequivocal. A literal translation of the words is those who are steadfast. In other words, those who are of the opinion that these opposition groups are worthy of support. There is no question this was a crime against humanity. This was a crime against decency. This was a crime against the greatest achievement of enlightenment, which is the freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of opinion. I'm not surprised that the Islamic Republic should have engaged in this crime and not even be aware of what they've done, because these are antediluvian people who believe they have a monopoly of the truth. It's in the holy book, the Quran, and anyone who dissents from that is a kafir, which is an infidel, and deserves to die.
The thing that really concerns me is the man on trial in Sweden, Hamid Nouri, committed the most horrendous crimes, but he was only the deputy on this. The director, the chief prosecutor of the Death Commission was Ibrahim Raisi. Ibrahim Raisi is the president of Iran today. And if I can add a personal note on this, and I've mentioned this on other shows, today, when we see the Biden administration going in to negotiate with Raisi's regime to say, please, please, would you stop your nuclear ambitions? From an Israeli point of view, and I've mentioned this, I find an equivalent to having Antony Blinken trying to negotiate or appeal the Iranian regime to be the equivalent of Neville Chamberlain trying to appeal to Adolf Hitler not to devour Europe. Now, what happened over there was, we know from history that Neville Chamberlain came back from Munich waving a paper saying peace in our times. I don't want to see the United States or Antony Blinken coming up to with some other false agreement with the Iranians, as Obama did, saying peace in our time. Because it appeals to me that the American administration either do not or will not recognize the real Iranian regime for what they are. So coming into what's going to happen here, and I'm talking particularly about Raisi, what is the process of bringing perpetrators of provable and massive crimes against humanity, such as Hamid Nouri and Ibrahim Raisi, to the International Criminal Court? What's the legal process?
Let me before I come to that, let me say I couldn't disagree at all with you. I totally agree regarding your observations on appeasement. I wholeheartedly endorse that view that this is not a regime you negotiate with. It will always see negotiation as a sign of weakness, and it's utterly untrustworthy. It's a regime of mass murder. And I'm afraid the wheels are going to come off this effort pretty quickly. So Barry, I couldn't disagree with you on that one. On the substance or the detail, this is a regime that denies the Holocaust. It makes no bones about its determination to exterminate Israel. It doesn't recognize the right of a UN member, Israel, to exist. It doesn't recognize the rights of the religious minorities, like the Baha'is in Iran, to exist. It discriminates against 50% of the population, which is the women. It's now adopted a arch a chauvinist Persian dictum, trying to wear the mantle of Cyrus the Great, whereas we know that Cyrus would be rolling in his grave to think that he would have anything in common with these people. So there is no excuse, none whatsoever, for those who seek to negotiate with this regime. This is playing with fire. The end game is going to come, like it or not, sooner or later. And the sooner the West wakes up to the nature of this regime, the better. I hope the trial of Hamid Nouri when it leads to his conviction, will show the world that Hamid Nouri was but a runner boy and no more. As you quite correctly say, he was only a deputy prosecutor. He was acting on the orders of this regime. The implication of this for Raisi is absolutely clear. In international law, superior command does not mean exoneration of the person who carried out the command, and it certainly means the condemnation of the person who gave the command. Mr. Raisi, along with Paul Mohammadi and Nayeri and the late unlamented Eshraghi, who was part of that death committee, they were the commanders, they were superiors who were given these commands, and therefore the conviction of Hamid Nouri is going to mean, under Article 28 of the International Criminal Court, that the superior commanders are carrying the responsibility. Once Hamid Nouri is convicted, and I have no doubt that he will be convicted, the can is passed to Mr. Raisi and indeed to Khamenei. Remember, Khamenei was the president of Iran at that time, and it will not do to say that I was only the president. No chairman of the board would say, I'm only the chairman. No president of a country can say, I was only the president. This was a decision of the judiciary. No, this was not a decision of the judiciary. It was a crime against humanity. At the time, international law had made it quite clear that this is a crime against humanity. International criminal law had not reached the stage where universal jurisdiction could be implemented as forcefully and as drastically as it can today, but nonetheless, the crime was there. And Khamenei is just as culpable in this as is indeed Raisi. Whether we can bring them to the International Criminal Court or not, well, there's a slight technical issue of Iran is not a member of the International Criminal Court, and the ICC only has jurisdiction over its members. But, and this is a significant proviso that I would urge your viewers to take on board. There is a procedure through the UN Security Council where if a reference is made to the Security Council that the behavior of a regime is such that it is bringing international peace into jeopardy, and Iran has definitely demonstrated that it's not exactly a peacenik, as it were, then the UN Security Council can refer the file to the International Criminal Court for them to open proceedings against the leadership of the Iranian regime. I believe that the conviction of Hamid Nouri, given that Hamid Nouri was indeed a stooge of the regime, and he carried out these crimes on behalf of and at the behest of the regime. He had no personal grudges against any of these victims that he murdered. These were not personal issues. This was, you could say there's nothing personal about this. Indeed, there isn't. There's everything political and criminal about this. That is to say, Hamid Nouri acted at the behest of the regime, at the head of which is Mr. Khamenei, who was president of Iran at that time, at the head of which at the moment today is Mr. Raisi, who was a co-conspirator with Hamid Nouri at the time. He was his superior commander. He was the one who was issuing the orders, although Nuri was selecting the people for individuals to bring them to the death committee, etc. And this has been fully documented in much writing by those who have survived. Nonetheless, Raisi carries the can here. The conviction of Hamid Nouri will open up very interesting opportunities for the Iranian opposition. And I, for one, shall certainly not be resting when the day arrives when that conviction is passed down from the court. And then I wish I'd been able to convince the prosecutor to to also charge him with the crime of genocide. Genocide, indeed, today is genocide, international genocide. Today, in 1948, Raphael Lemkin, the Jewish-Polish lawyer, was able to convince the United Nations General Assembly to pass the genocide resolution. Up to that point, we did not have a crime of genocide. From that point, we do. And much ink has been used up, and much jurisprudence has developed since the proceedings of the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And we know what genocide means. I was satisfied as a lawyer that this man had engaged in the crime of genocide, but the prosecutor wasn't prepared to entertain it. But that's fine. That's okay. Had she been willing to do that, our task of opening the door first to the Security Council and then via the Security Council to the International Criminal Court would have been much easier. But not to worry, there'll be the next one, and there'll be the next one, and we're learning our trade better every time. I am observing the election. I'm observing the issues that the prosecutors elected to pursue, and kind of defenses that are being put up by Nouri's counsel, and we'll be better armed next time. Shall we say we are sharpening our tool to be better armed for the next time the next Hamid Nouri walks into a jurisdiction which exercises universal jurisdiction over crimes against humanity.
Before I come on to the final question I have of you, Kaveh, I make the note over here that we simply don't seem to learn from history. The nature of the Nazi regime was clearly recognized by the Jews of Germany and Europe, even as it was not recognized by the powers at the time of Britain and the United States. And the same applies today to the Iranian regime. It is impossible to negotiate with these hateful regimes that want to annihilate Jews, even as they're murdering their own people. Now, we didn't have an international criminal court at the time of the Second World War. And we had to wait until Nuremberg before the Nazis were brought to justice. But of course, by that time, 6 million Jews were dead. I simply hope that the world powers, the United Nations Security Council, the International Criminal Court, will not wait until Iran has murdered even 1,000 more of their own people and launched nuclear missiles against Israel, the Jewish state, before a sort of Nuremberg trial is imposed on people like Nuri, Ibrahim Raisi, and others. The clock is ticking. We don't have the time. So if we come out of this interview, I want to ask you, because I would like to make an appeal to the people watching this, particularly human rights organizations and NGOs, Iranians and not Iranians, people who care about justice, law organizations, legal organizations, international NGOs. If we want to bring this issue to the wider audience, if we want to recruit politicians, officials, strategic affairs, academic institutions, lawyers, NGOs, in order to put pressure on even the United Nations Security Council to address this issue and to appeal to the International Criminal Court to bring war crimes or crimes against humanity charges against the people who were guilty at that time, who are the ones in power today in Iran. What do we need to do in order to galvanize a global response to do something about this?
Well, Barry, I'm glad you asked that, because I'm reminded of the Eichmann trial in Israel in 1961. At the time, there was a global effort to forget the crimes of the Nazis against the Jewish people and the crimes against humanity. Raphael Lemkin, in a very unexciting but deeply moving book, when he documented the rule of the Wehrmacht in Eastern Europe, he opened the door to the Genocide Convention. He documented step by using the law and legal methods what Hannah Arendt later called the banality of evil. A machinery of mass murder was being put together by decrees, by edicts, by regulations, by legislation, by statute, by law, which became the machinery of the grotesquest, the most egregious crime against humanity, the Holocaust that has taken place in the history of bloodshed that records humanity. This really was something sui generis. It was something different. The Holocaust was something completely different. I had hoped that we have learned the lesson. The Eichmann trial brought to a halt that machinery of whitewash. The machinery that said, now we are in the middle of a Cold War and we got to let the bygones be bygones. You know, bygones have an uncanny habit of not allowing themselves to be forgotten and become bygones. You do not murder 6 million people and hope to get away with it because now you've joined the West, the coalition of the West. We know that immediately after the Second World War, a great many of German scientists were immediately taken to the United States to help the operations of the military of the Western powers in order to face the new confrontation with the Soviet Union and the Cold War. And in the light of that, under the shadow of that, there was a conscious effort to sweep under the carpet the bestiality and the criminality that is otherwise known as the Holocaust. The Eichmann trial stopped all of that. I would invite your audience to go and look at the proceedings of the German parliament at that time. There was legislation endeavoring to bring a statute of limitations and end the criminal trials of the Nazis and those who'd engaged in those egregious crimes against humanity between 1939 and 1945, or indeed earlier, when the first Nuremberg laws began to be implemented in Nazi Germany before the beginning of the Second World War. It's a reminder that that trial, the Eichmann trial, was a shocking reminder to the world that you cannot let bygones just be bygones. Because if you do that, they'll come back and bite you even harder. There is a word called impunity. If you grant immunity to these people, you grant impunity to the next lot. In order to stop these things happening again and again and again, we got to draw a red line and say enough, and here is no more. The Islamic Republic of Iran, it makes no apology, and it denies the Holocaust. It makes no apology in that saying it is out to destroy Israel. It makes no apology in that it denies the rights of women to equal treatment. It makes no apology in claiming having to have rights and the monopoly of truth and therefore justice and everything else that emanates from the arrogance of a mind that says, I have a monopoly over the truth. You know, it's a pre-enlightenment mindset. It has no place in the world in the 21st century. Unless we wake up to this message, and we wake up sooner rather than later, we will wake up one morning to find that Iran has the bomb. it would not hesitate to use the bomb. These are people who are willing to walk over mines in the belief that within minutes they're going to be in heaven. These people have no hesitation once they get the bomb in using it. It is imperative that by showing them that they have individual criminal responsibility, that they cannot hide behind the excuse of superior command. It is imperative that we show them that the sooner they abandon this regime, the better for them, because they will not be able to hide. International criminal law has reached a stage where there is no impunity, there is no statute of limitations. Most of these people are still, those who are carrying out these crimes right now, in their 40s, early 50s. So by ordinary reckoning, they've got another 30, 40 years to go. If they do, they must know that they're going to be hunted to the end of their lives, to the four corners of the earth. The arrest of Hamid Nouri is a very clear message to them that you may think you're immune inside Iran, but outside you're not. And since you can see that the regime is collapsing by the hour, the sooner you come and join the right side of history, the better it is for you, the better it is for your children and your families, and the better it is for Iran, the Middle East, the region, and the world. The sooner you learn the lesson of history, the better it is for all of you.
Yes, Mr. Moussavi, I'm no expert on international criminal law, but I was reminded by Erwin Kotler, the former Canadian Minister of Justice and an international jurist, that according to the International Criminal Court, incitement to genocide is recognized by the International Criminal Court as a crime against humanity. And they have imposed this on one or two criminals, massive criminals, ahead of genocide in various conflicts in Africa. This also could be used as part of the campaign to bring people like Nuri and to bring Raisi to the International Criminal Court. I want to thank you, Mr. Moussavi, for coming onto this program, and I will certainly promise you that I will do my best to help spread the word of this and make contact from us here in Israel, from the Israel Institute of Strategic Study, with anybody who wants us to cooperate with them to take this forward. But I thank you for your contribution. I would want to welcome you back onto this show if you have any further information you want to share to a global audience. Thank you very much for your contribution today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Viewers, my message to you is this. There is a clear message here from us at the Israel Institute of Strategic Studies and the View from Israel, that if you're not going to arrest Ibrahim Raisi for his threats to annihilate Israel, then arrest him for the crimes against humanity that he's been doing against his own people. I want you please to share this important video, and you can help raise attention to this by clicking the like button and also the subscribe button as well, which would give it more recognition. From our point of view, we will be sharing this globally because I think we're bringing you an important message, and we hope some of you will get on board to take this case further. Thank you very much. This is Barry Shaw from The View from Israel.
Thank you, Barry.